looking back on 2025, amid all the changes and the U.S. policy, driven shifts and directions in healthcare, what were the key lessons for biopharma leaders, do you think, in agility and resilience, and trying to maintain focus on patients, patient care, and on their business as well? What do you think were the key lessons?
Yeah, I think 1 year ago, there was a lot of uncertainty, meaning people just didn't know what was going to happen. And I think people were trying to be optimistic about it. So one learning was obviously things transpired in a way that pharma was not necessarily expecting. But after all the announcements, after those letters were sent out, we have got to a point where at least some of the risk has been mitigated because 16 of the 17 deals have been signed and so on. So there is obviously some give and take, but there is this sense of, okay, there is more certainty now in terms of how the future is going to unfold with regard to policy pressures, particularly on pricing, than there was a year ago. So that's a good thing. And we have to find a way to navigate now that we have a little bit more certainty. The second learning was that as a result of that uncertainty, I think deal activity, and by deal activity, I mean not just mergers and acquisitions, but more importantly, in licensing deals and business development type of stuff that typically happens. The year ended strong. And in fact, as a whole, 2025 was much better than what we had seen in 2024, which itself was a significant dip below what we had seen in 2023. So you can sort of see the broad sweep of the cycle going. And I think the anticipation is for 3 or 4 reasons that this momentum of essentially importing innovation from smaller companies, essentially more in-licensing deals with biotech the world over, will continue fairly strong, we think. There's excitement and there is the appetite and the willingness to buy up some of that innovation. I think a third thing happened in 2025, which I will call as a global economic shift, not necessarily something that happened out of Washington. And this is an important one we've been watching. Somewhat came up as a surprise, I think, how quickly it progressed, is the rise of China as an innovator, not just a copycat, as an innovator, especially when it comes to clinical trials and drug development. Because historically, of course, we've all had our views of China, but I think, and they didn't do it in 1 year, of course. They've been sort of building up towards it through the way that they think about the ecosystem, and they've repeated this story from what they did in electric vehicles, for instance. But we are seeing, for the first time, there are more trials in China than there are in the US. Right? So that was a big milestone. Another big milestone is something like nearly half of new molecules going into human trials are actually in China. And so this idea that innovation is largely from emerging biopharma, biotech companies here is no longer the case. And I think that also caused people to start rethinking very fundamental assumptions. So those were some of the stories. And to come back to your question, Michael, what were the lessons in terms of resilience and adaptability? I think one was very clear that rather than focusing on things that will change and might change, we need to focus back on the things that don't change and won't change. Meaning, let's not lose sight of the fact that pharma's business model is source innovation where it is, accelerate things going from great science, but never forget the fact that at the end of the day, you have to deliver patient impact. And so if you go back to some of the very basic things that pharma does, and it's been part of their model for decades, I think that helped stabilize pharma to say, look, there are 3 or 4 key things we have to do. And so let's find a way to get them done as opposed to reacting to every change that might come. So that was, I think, one lesson in resilience is the going back to the things that don't change. The second piece was rather than trying to predict everything, because I think that is our first, every organization wants to know exactly what's going to happen. Let's try to predict exactly where price will land. I think it became more about what are some fundamental capabilities we need to build as an organization so we can keep reacting whatever happens, but let's react quickly. So as opposed to try to predict something and make sure we get it right, and then slowly build towards that, because that world is gone in some sense. How can we create things like a more analytical, agile, data-driven way so that we can keep reacting? I'll give you an example just to make it very concrete. Supply chain and manufacturing, just to pick up a slightly different topic. Clearly, as a result of policy, again, things like tariffs, things like certain embargoes in certain parts of the world. And obviously all kinds of political, geopolitical, and other things happening, like shipping disasters and this and that. This idea that historically pharma didn't worry about supply chain and manufacturing resilience for many years. COVID, of course, changed that. But now there's a different type of issue. I think on average, there are something like 8 key events in the life of a supply chain executive in pharma, which they have to prepare for, are sort of significant disruptions. So the first question became, do we even know what are all the things happening in the world which might affect some obscure inbound chemical compound that we don't even manufacture, but that we need as part of our supply chain? So how do we get much better at sensing what's going on, how much of it is there, when is it going to matter, do I need to pay attention to it? So that was another learning, which is it's less about action, it is also about listening, but listening really, really well and deeply to all these things that are happening. And then, of course, once you listen and once you figure out what might affect your trajectory, and I can go more detail, how do I then do things like predict very specific things, like not broadly what's happened to supply chain, but what happens to stockouts? Here are the 8 key molecules I'm tracking. Where will the stockout happen? Can I get a 6-month read on it? And then play out the different scenarios in terms of changing supply chains. And as the tariff announcements came out, that sort of approach was actually very useful because pharma learned to think about possibilities, optionality, choices, simulate things quickly but not super accurately, right? So perfect became the enemy of good in some sense. And so this idea of being agile, reacting quickly, short horizon thinking, as opposed to I have to get it perfectly because I'm thinking about a 10-year horizon, which used to be historically the way pharma worked, because of course that's the way pipelines work. So let me pause here. Hopefully that gives you a flavor of what this year has seen for the industry.
You mentioned China, the
Mm-hmm.
growth and innovation. How does that sort of feed into their supply chain strategy? I mean, do you see more U.S. pharmas or biotechs looking to conduct more trials in China, and then get back? Like, how does that jibe with their with the tariffs and the manufacturing focus, like U.S. based manufacturing and things like that?
Right. So I think there are two different stories here. One is, so maybe let me address them separately. One is you can actually do a clinical trial in China at least, well, there's a big range here, so 30 to 60% faster. What does this mean? This means that I can actually compress into months instead of years the thing I was trying to do to detect a signal in the data to see what kind of dosing or molecule regimen or patient profile is actually the right thing to pursue. So I can retire risk much earlier in the trial. So phase 1, phase 2, maybe even some parts of preclinical. Because I can do that. Now, keep in mind, by the way, that doing a clinical trial, full clinical trial in China is not really the point, because that data is not admissible in the US. So it's not like I can just do the trial there and report it here. But because I can do something especially early faster, so much faster, I can, in parallel, as I learn that, start the appropriate clinical trial in Europe or Australia or the US with the right information. And what that does is it boosts my PTRS tremendously, the probability of success tremendously, because now I know what is the protocol, what is the patient profile, what is the dosing regimen, how do I construct the trial so that it's much more likely to succeed in the right way. And so that way of thinking about it, that I'm almost working with the Chinese company to learn so that I can do a much more effective trial where I need to do it. Because again, Europe will regard, but the EMA may be much more open, at least on paper, to actually making the Chinese data admissible, but the US currently does not, the FDA does not allow that. So that's sort of one way of thinking about it, which is I have now got a way to experiment and learn and transfer the knowledge across the globe. But to your other point, pharma is also having a debate. So I would say that pharma CEOs are not aligned completely on how they think about this trend. I think there is a sector of people in the US who might say, you know what, this is very dangerous. The Chinese companies will come up with innovation. We should make sure our capital is not flying to China, because one of the challenges that China has seen is there's not enough Chinese money to capitalize all that innovation to success. So the Chinese molecules are still looking to US capital to come and in license and pay them money and so on. And of course, taking an equity position may be much more complicated in a Chinese company, but so licensing is sort of preferred. But even then, the US might get protectionist and say, you know what, no, you can't do that. There is some restriction on capital flight. This is not a good thing for US innovation. We need to protect the US innovation industry. That's one direction. Another direction could be, hey, global patients need help. And so if I go back to sort of very, very basic way of thinking about patient centricity, the innovation, regardless of where it happens, is good for patients. So we should actually encourage this, because what this might mean is if you can do trials much faster and much earlier, you can overall perhaps bring down the cost of pharmaceutical R&D globally, even in the US, because now you are working with more certainty. And so this could be actually helpful if the US government, for instance, is thinking about how do I make sure that the pharmaceutical industry is able to get more affordable, right? So you can imagine, depending on how I interpret this wave, which way we go. I think it's early days to figure out what side will win. It'll probably be a little bit of both. Now, Europe is caught in a very interesting dilemma, of course, given all the things that are happening, which is if Europe is forced to even reduce healthcare costs further, they might be much more open to Chinese innovation than US innovation. And since the Chinese innovators are not really selling in China per se, they need a market. And they might say, geopolitically, Europe is much more friendlier than trying to worry about going to the US. So you can begin to see that within these three sort of big spheres, there are many possible relationships and closeness and arrows that are being drawn up. And so it's a time of great flux. But I think what is undeniable is that this potential of China to have a big impact on clinical development is very clear. It's here. And how it unfolds over the next, I would say, 3 to 5 years will be a very, very interesting thing to see. Now, your second point you raised about manufacturing, I don't know that that's such a big risk because, as you know, most of the APIs come from China and India anyway. So, assuming nothing gets worse there, and I don't have any reason to believe that it will do, I think manufacturing-wise, it may be less of a challenge. I think this dynamic that I'm talking about is much more about the trials themselves.
Is there a push for more R&D capacity to be based in the U.S.? And is that more difficult for for biotechs per se to kind of comply with, or is that even an issue?
I don't know that that's a big issue. I think for the smaller biotechs, the main issue had been funding had been hard. So of course they went through this big collapse in 2023. Things are beginning to come back up. So I think the mood at JPM this year in terms of that matching was much better, much more optimistic. But overall, and we work with a lot of the emerging pharma companies directly, I would say R&D per se is not a concern. I think the broader concern is if there is a significant flight of capital away from US innovators because of some of the things I just talked about, that might become a concern. But as such, R&D or manufacturing are not high on people's radar of immediate things to worry about.